All right, looks like most people have joined us. My name is Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending our webinar, Global Visions of Freedom, a roundtable discussion on radical Black internationalism, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the association, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat at the end of our conversation today. A few logistical things to consider before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions for the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but want to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like to be part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording on the AHA YouTube channel after the session. I'd now like to turn things over to the chair of our panel today, Russell John Rickford from Cornell University. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Debbie, and thanks also to Victor Del Toro. Victor and Debbie are intrepid AHA guardians, wards. Appreciate the support and welcome to all of you. I am Russell Rickford. I'm a historian here at Cornell University. I'm very excited for our conversation today. My own specialty is the Black radical tradition, Black transnational movements, and African-American political culture after World War II. Lots of overlap with our esteemed panelists today. I actually am also working on a book about transnationalism, about African-Americans and the role of Guyana, South America, in the Black radical imaginary of the 1970s. So I'm especially thrilled to have this opportunity to moderate this amazing panel. I want to say just a few words about our theme today before I introduce our panelists. So it's an especially opportune moment to discuss the status of Black transnational history. For one thing, you know, the latest transnational turn in Black history, and I say that advisedly, the latest turn, has now produced such a wide and diverse literature that we can truly say that the field has matured. You know, I think it's a good time to take stock. I teach a class on Black power and transnationalism. I'm teaching again in the fall, and I'm having a devil of a time putting together the syllabus because there's just so much amazing new work. But it's also, I think, an opportune time for this, an auspicious time for this conversation, because we're conscious that as our discussion unfolds, there are ongoing struggles in places like Palestine and Colombia that have deep transnational implications. So some of the most urgent questions of transnationalism that we attempt to address as historians remain politically relevant. You know, the basic impulse of transnational history, of course, is the desire to transcend the nation state as a central category of analysis. And all the panelists today and their work are part of this ongoing effort to move beyond the limits of the nation state as our sort of basic unit of analysis, of historical analysis. You know, in my own work, I have a habit, and perhaps it's a bad habit, of using the terms internationalism and transnationalism more or less synonymously. But maybe we can sort of circle back to that question later on. But the truth is that for many of us, transnationalism has specific connotations, right? So for example, an emphasis perhaps on movement of ideas, groups, goods, technology, people, et cetera, across national borders. So it's sort of a concern with circulation, not simply as a motif, but as an analytic approach and method. Transnational history or internationalism can also suggest a concern, and in this case, this is relevant, I think, with non-elite or non-state actors It can be seen as an alternative to globalization, defined in terms of the relationship between states in the world system. So as Robin Kelly and other scholars have pointed out, African-American history and Black history more broadly has almost always implied transnational approaches, right? And indeed, time and time again, Black activists have refused to allow national boundaries to define their field of vision. They've refused to see racism as a strictly domestic problem. They've refused to see anti-racism as disconnected from larger questions of global emancipation. And as historian Gerald Horne has argued, part of scrutinizing African Americans in their own terms entails shedding the automatic notion that somehow they're always striving for US nationality. And I have to say, on a personal note, as someone who sort of came of age in the 90s, even as a teenager in high school, reading Malcolm X and listening to sort of Pan-Africanist hip hop, I was always deeply skeptical of this notion that the most that African Americans could aspire to politically or socially was sort of greater incorporation within a sort of national, polity. So in any case, transnationalism or internationalism might be seen as an essential response to Black people's predicament in the West, right? As part of how Black people strove to recreate themselves as free and sovereign subjects in societies that define them at best as non-entities. In short, transnationalism or internationalism raises critical questions about the ways Black people imagine and construct citizenship and belonging, right? Forge political and cultural identities, imagine, define, and pursue freedom and power. So with that, let me offer some introductions and we'll launch into our discussion. And I have to say that Kennetta Perry unfortunately can't be with us today. She had an urgent situation that she had to deal with. So we're sorry to miss her, but we will forge onward. So let me start by introducing Keisha and Blain. Keisha Blain is an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research interests include Black internationalism, radical politics, and global feminisms. She's the author of Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom, the recipient of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Book Prize and the Darlene Clark Hine Award from the Organization of American Historians. Blaine is the co-editor of To Turn the World Over, Black Women and Internationalism, as well as New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition, and Charleston Syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence. Today, Blaine will discuss Black women's engagement with Japan, both real and imagined, during the early 20th century. Next, we'll have Christopher M. Tinson. Christopher Tinson is an associate professor of Africana Studies and History at St. Louis University, where he's the director of the African American Studies program. His research and teaching focuses on histories of Africana radical traditions, US ethnic studies, critical media studies, incarceration, and race and sports. He's the author of Radical Intellect, Liberator Magazine, and Black Activism in the 1960s, the recipient of the inaugural Pauli Murray Prize for Best Book in African American Intellectual History. Today, Tinson will discuss the radicalism that emerged among Black activists, intellectuals, and workers in the mid to late 20th century. And finally, Ashley Farmer. Dr. Farmer is a historian of Black women's history, intellectual history, and radical politics. She is an assistant professor in the Department of History and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. She's the author of Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era, the first comprehensive study of Black women's intellectual production and activism in the Black Power era. She's the co-editor of New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition. Today, Farmer will discuss the political work of Queen Mother Audley Moore, one of my favorites, a key figure in Pan-African and Black internationalist organizing in the second half of the 20th century. So as you can see, we've got a smoking panel for you today. Here's the loose format I thought we'd use. The panelists will take just a few minutes each to describe their current projects, offer an overview. I may take the chair's prerogative to ask a follow-up question about these individual projects, depending on how we're doing for time. But we'll move swiftly into a broader conversation and try to pose some sort of overarching questions about Black transnationalism. And then we'll try and open up to the audience in the last, we'll try and give it about 20 minutes or so. So please be sure to keep the questions coming in the chat. So first up, we'll have Professor Blain.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I think it's so wonderful that we are able to come together virtually to have this conversation, despite the many challenges we're facing, certainly as a nation, but also that we're facing globally. As many of you know, I work on Black women's internationalism, primarily in the 20th century. And as Professor Rickford explained, my earlier projects, particularly Set the World on Fire, looked at Black nationalist women. And I tried to explain how these women shaped national and global politics, starting with the 1920s, with the Garvey movement, and really connecting that history to the 1960s with Black power. Of course, Professor Farmer, who's on the panel, as I always tell people, if you're assigning our books together, I start with mine and then continue with hers, because in many ways, I end with the Black power, but don't really get into the kind of depth of analysis that Professor Farmer gets into in her book, Remaking Black Power. So it's just, both books, I think, work so beautifully in helping us understand how Black women are crucial to shaping not only nationalist politics, but internationalist politics as well. And so right now I'm working on several projects, and one of those projects is one that I'm tentatively calling East Unites with West. And as the title implies, it is a project that is attempting to explain the connections between, primarily I'm interested in Black women in the United States and the connections that they are forging with Asian activists and intellectuals, and more specifically with Japanese activists and intellectuals. And this is, a study that comes out of Set the World on Fire, essentially while writing about Mitty Magdalena Gordon, who's one of the key historical figures in Set the World on Fire. I was struck by the kinds of collaborations that she was trying to form, primarily in the 1930s, and then even in the 1940s leading up to World War II. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but suffice to say, as I explained in Set the World on Fire, it's actually her collaboration with Japanese activists, her very open support for Japan, even after Pearl Harbor, that leads to her arrest, her imprisonment, and she is charged with the crime of sedition. And so her story as a Black nationalist, as a Black internationalist, is deeply connected to a larger narrative about Afro-Asian solidarity in the 20th century. And as I was writing about her and reading about these kinds of narratives, I wanted to understand about the other ways that Black women might have been involved in Afro-Asian political and social movements, and primarily at the grassroots level in the United States. And here's where I'm trying to grapple more with what I talk about in Set the World on Fire as grassroots internationalism. I'm trying to make sense of the varied ways that people who have limited formal education, people who are perhaps working class or working poor might be more accurate, how they attempted to engage in internationalist politics when they do not necessarily have the means to travel as others who might be in the Black middle class or elite. And so part of that is grappling with what are the creative expressions of internationalism? And for me, one of those creative expressions is trying to tap into the networks within one city, for example. And we see that taking place in Chicago, and we certainly see that taking place in Detroit. And so one of the narratives that I'm focused on right now is centering the ideas and the experiences of a Black woman, a working class Black woman who's located in Detroit in the 1930s, and I've written shorter pieces on her, Pearl Sherrod. And I talk about Pearl Sherrod as just an example of someone who didn't travel much. You know, the only time she actually left the United States, the physical borders of the United States, was when she went to Vancouver, Canada in 1937. But her story is so crucial to understanding expressions of Black internationalism in the 20th century. And she's using an array of avenues, right, including the Black press, which is so important, in as you all know, so important in this history. And she's also trying to connect with those who are traveling through the city of Detroit, people who are coming directly from Japan in some instances, and people who are really trying to grapple with how to dismantle white supremacy and how to do so at a global level. And for them, it's about bringing people of African descent together with people of Asian descent to challenge systems of oppression. And so I'm really trying, and it has been difficult, as you can imagine, with the global pandemic, but I'm trying to pull together a broader narrative that would help us see and understand the crucial role that Black women played in forging networks and solidarities through the lens of Afro-Asia that I think are important to understand the broader history that connects certainly to the Bandung conference that we talk about, as well as later expressions, through the vein of Black power, for example. So I'll stop there, but I just want to thank you all again for listening, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Keisha. Next up, we'll have Professor Chris Tinson.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you. It's great to see my colleagues, although virtually. I think that, and I know we're going to get into this, but one of the things about terminology that I think is important is the question of how we define Black internationalism or radical Black internationalism. And I think in my research, the terms, I agree with Professor Rickford in the sense of saying sometimes we do use terms interchangeably, but it's also important to follow the language and as Professor Blaine was saying, the lens of which the activists themselves are articulating their kind of internationalism. Because the term internationalism, obviously, in its original sense, if there is an original sense, is a kind of sense of attachment to organized labor efforts in a European context, right? The four internationals that we know of the 19th and 20th century. And I think that, kind of prepare us for the changes that would happen during the World War II period that kind of shifts how we understand global labor and who's a worker and who's recognized as a global laborer and who can organize them in that kind of way. And so I think putting this in that kind of historical framework helps us to understand the genealogy of the term, but it's also to say, where did Black activists break from those kinds of moments, if you will, right? And that kind of framing of a kind of non-European centered look at Black labor globally. And I think that that's pretty much, we all share that kind of commitment in terms of our research and looking outside of a specific European labor context. But I think that there's a historical understanding of the way in which Black activists, Black organizers saw European labor movements, drew inspiration, tried to develop ties, or just completely, shifted their focus. So I think we can talk about that a little bit more too as we go on. But I think that, depending on which organization or which person you're talking about, obviously you're thinking about different networks that are shaping, but also different individual connections that people could tie themselves to. So my research really kind of looks at people who are in and out of the organized labor movement and people who are in and out of the organized left. And I do think that there is a specifically left orientation when we talk about Black internationalism that I think we have to account for. But it also brings up a lot of contradictions because a lot of people are working through national landscapes, and their ability to travel, in fact, is also often defined by where they're physically located. In that regard, it's astounding that the Black activists that we study were able to develop the international networks that they were able to develop. It talks about the importance of the Black radical press. It talks about the importance of utilizing being able to travel, the moment that you're able to travel, that you're talking about connection with workers, that you're talking about learning new languages in the case of, Paul Robeson and others who are trying to really connect with people on the ground in their own locale from their own vantage point. And I think that that's a particular important feature of the organizing that we're trying to historicize here, because it really was not just about an intellectual movement or even historicizing the movement. It's really about how do we actually make the lives of workers around the world better? And what's the framework? What's the container? What are the definitions to bring about that work? And I think that at the germ of all of the movements that we're thinking about, and the people that we write about, it's that question, it's that concern, it's that consciousness, the global consciousness that leads one to say, I'm going to go and travel and try to get with the workers, rather than, the liberal elites, or rather than, just the heads of state, but also really see what people on the ground are dealing with, and how can we work to the betterment of their lives. But there's also this space in terms of coming from a US context of complicity, right, in a kind of project that is an imperial project that in fact enables in many senses our ability to travel, or people on this side ability to move around in particular kind of ways. I think that, so whenever we talk about revolutionary internationalism, we have to also think about the contradictions that bubble up immediately in terms of who's able to get around and on whose behalf are those people moving. I think that that's a challenge of our research. And it's really the challenge of how we understand, what we're looking for in archives as well, to how we piece these stories together. Because I think that the contradictions are as much as important of our attention, demand our attention, as the actual connections themselves, or the kind of ways in which we can kind of triumph a particular consciousness. The contradictions inside of that is also important. So I think that we try to mark those things as well. I'm sorry, I'm gonna just say one brief thing, Professor Rickford, if you allow me, about the research that I'm working on. And the reason why I'm talking about the contours is precisely because of this research, which pulled me in a different direction, and it was totally inspired by Professor Farmer and Professor Blaine. And that's to relook at Toni Cade Bambara and her work in Vietnam. And so I've been looking at the Vietnam notebooks and trying to think about how she was thinking about internationalism. And also people like June Jordan, who I'm glad that you mentioned Palestine at the top, because June Jordan was very invested in Palestinian struggle. And so I'm looking at these two women in particular, as well as Sophia Bukhari, who was an anti-prison activist and an internationalist, to think about spaces that we don't look for Black internationalism, right? And some, because there's a lot of people who might be some kind of the headline names, like I mentioned Robeson, there might be some other folks, Du Bois, who are kind of the headline names, the first thing we think about Black internationalism. But there's many other people who I would say fit in the Black internet or radical Black internationalist frame, who don't get situated as such. Why? Because they wrote literature, or they wrote poetry, or they taught in university. And so we don't understand their activism as being an expression of Black internationalism. So I'm trying to look again at those kinds of political actors, if you will, to think about how they help us to stretch out, redefine, and in some senses, undermine perhaps what we've conventionally known as a Black internationalist project, right? And I don't mean undermine in a negative sense. I mean just kind of disrupting conventional notions, or the kind of sectarianism that we can fall into if we're saying, if you don't align with this particular thing, then you're not internationalist. And so I think that those women in particular, many of their associates, kind of disrupt that. And so that's why I wanted to talk about the contours as much, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But that's some of the latest work that I'm working on right now, in addition to a project on Claude Lightfoot, who was a Black communist out of Chicago. But I can talk about that another time. Thank you.
Right on, appreciate that. I'm so mad at y'all for doing these multiple projects all at once, making me feel inadequate. Thanks so much, Professor Tinson, and finally, Professor Farmer.
Hey everyone, it's good to see y'all, and thanks everybody for being here. Today I'm going to talk about my latest project, which is a biography of Queen Mother Audley More. And so certainly More was a consummate intellectual and activist in her own right, but I also think that she's a great lens through which to understand some of the contours of Pan-Africanism and internationalism throughout the 20th century. So just to give people the briefest of overviews, Queen Mother Moore was born in 1898 and died in 1997. So her life and the majority of her activism also reflects the contours of Black liberalism, Black nationalism, and Black radicalism in the 20th century. She got into the idea of internationalism, or kind of that there was this global scope of white supremacy and that imperialist countries were working together through the Garvey movement. And there was a couple of themes that developed that she held tight to, and I would argue really promulgated and served as a bridge for much of the 20th century. And I'm gonna offer just a couple of brief examples of that in the time that I have today. So as the story goes, she saw Garvey in New Orleans. Garvey was not allowed to speak because we know that the white supremacists didn't love somebody rousing people towards Black nationalism. He was put in jail, released, and the next day, the entirety of New Orleans came out with their guns packing. She said she had one in her pocketbook, one in her bra, right? And stood on the shelves of the Longshoremen's Hall to say, to allow Garvey to speak. And she says she became a Garveyite then and there. And what's interesting about it is that she says that she really did aspire towards kind of a white supremacist ideal instead of class politics, and that she would have actually been what she called herself, a bourgeois little stinker, had she not been, her words, not mine, radicalized both by Garveyite politics, but also a quick fall out of the elite class when her parents died when she was relatively young, and she went from being among New Orleans elite to really being, a domestic worker and poor working class woman. So with a clear sense of kind of a different class politic and now somewhat of a better understanding of the global scope of white supremacy, she devoted the rest of her life to an understanding of what Garvey would say of Africa for the Africans, but also to helping people understand a Black freedom movement that was not based in the American nation state, but rather a real and imagined Black nation. And I just want to point out a couple of ways in which she did that. And I think this really speaks to also our conversations about travel and class politics. Queen Mother Moore had a 4th grade education. She did not travel until she was in her 70s and 80s, and she was only really able to travel abroad because activists paid the money to support her. She never really had a steady job because she was devoted to the movement. So a large amount of her life was really spent fostering Pan-Africanism within the confines of the United States. And so one of the ways in which she did this was through her group, the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. And you can see the UAW, the UNIA, what she's doing there. This was one of the first groups to really advocate for a couple of key things. One, they were connecting everyday civil rights struggles, whether that be the welfare rights of Black women or exonerating Black men on trumped up charges of raping white women in Angola jail, to a larger struggle in Africa and decolonization. She constantly framed those folk on the ground in New Orleans as Africans or Ethiopians, right? And there was no press release that happened, no statement in any newspaper where she was not simply saying that the issues of colonization and apartheid, right, are the same issues that are taking place in Louisiana. She always framed them as kind of two sides of the same coin or a continuation of struggle. And through that group, she came to two conclusions, which she became known for in the latter half of the 20th century. The first is this resurrection of the Black nation state, right? She actually advocated mostly for that state to take place on American soil, a kind of resurrection of the Communist Party's Black Belt thesis. But also secondly, reparations. And certainly she meant reparations as, a payment for Jim Crow and slavery, but she also explicitly saw reparations as a way to kind of reconnect the severed ties that were broken during the transatlantic slave trade. She certainly thought that we were owed money, but she thought through advocating for reparations, it could be a conduit through which Black people all over the world could connect with each other and unite and struggle, right? And then finally, when she was actually able to go abroad in her later life, she was the kind of guest of various heads of state from Tanzania to Uganda, et cetera, in part because of this long sustained history of grassroots Pan-Africanism and protest. Some of the folks that she was hanging out with were very problematic, like, right? We can talk about that as well. But there were a couple things that she consistently brought to these major events. And some of these events included things like the Pan-African Congresses, with the 6th one taking place in Tanzania, and also like the All Africa Women's Congress. And when she gave speeches or when she was talking, she was constantly asserting that Black people in America were Africans just like them, that they were united in their struggle against imperialism and racism. And despite what might have seemed kind of on the outside as a relatively conservative gender politics, she was constantly encouraging Black women to be at the forefront of breaking down these barriers, both between Americans and Africans, but also between people of different African nations, to come together around decolonization, reparations, and kind of a liberated Black nation, figuratively, as well as actually literally in places like Africa. So I think that what Queen Mother Moore can offer us in thinking about ideas of internationalism and Pan-Africanism is, how are ideas about Pan-Africanism sustained on a day-to-day level? Certainly we all know of things like the Pan-African Congresses, but most people weren't a part of those. But everyday people, and I would add Queen Mother Moore into this, were able to kind of practice a politics that had their eye trained on the everyday issues that people were facing, but were never severed from the larger, Black community globally. And that this idea kept these kinds of conversations alive in between these kind of major events that largely men and largely elite men attended and kind of created, some of the documents that we talk about today. We also have to talk about, through Queen Mother Moore, a very interesting conversation about what Africa and Africanisms looks like. She was certainly a proponent, right, and put her life and money on the line for any time somebody wanted to decolonize, but she had a very kind of undifferentiated and sometimes essentialist view of that, right? We can argue that some of that maybe came from an inability to travel till later in life and really see what life was on the ground. But I would argue that some of that also served a kind of rhetorical purpose that united folks in a different way. So we might talk about, the ways in which, essentialism and kind of togetherness promote a Pan-African vision while at the same time undermining the very real differences the differently, positioned Black people around the world face. And then finally, I just think that it's important to think about broadening our concept of who we think are major, internationalist or Pan-African actors and thinkers. We kind of have a canon of folks that we continue to kind of cite and engage in as the folks that did this. But we have to ask ourselves who was on the ground, who was making these changes, who was asking people every day while on the street corner, have you ever thought about why there's a jail here, right? And there's colonialism here and why you're going to the military there, and how that might have done a lot of intellectual work and shaped a lot of our thinkers, everybody from, a Tanzanian president to Malcolm X that we're not accounting for. So I hope that we can kind of talk a little bit about the daily kind of, I guess you would say, idiosyncratic practices of internationalism and Pan-Africanism, and also some of the problems that come from that practice as well.
Thanks so much, Professor Farmer. And so clearly, we are going to have a good time. So again, I think I will use my bully pulpit here and maybe direct some specific questions to each of the panelists, but already I think these remarks are speaking to each other in really intriguing ways. I liked the sort of framework that Christopher Tinson offered in terms of looking at the complexities and contradictions, some of which you all have sort of already alluded to. So let me ask these three questions, one for each of you, but certainly feel free to respond to and engage with each other. So, Keisha Blain talked about creative expressions of internationalism. Christopher Tinson talked about the genealogy of political ideas and the language. Ashley Farmer talked about a real and imagined Black nationhood, a resurrection of the CP Party's Black Belt Nation thesis, an intentional dialectic between a sort of local and an international Black community. So I guess my first question would be for Keisha, again, along this line of complexities and contradictions. I wanted to ask about relationship to empire, right? Because I imagine that much of your work involves sort of unearthing the critique of Western liberal democracy, or perhaps a rejection altogether of Western liberal democracy as a kind of framework for inclusion, for social belonging, for full citizenship, for equality. But in that process, right, the kind of allegiances and solidarities that your historical subjects are constructing sometimes involves sort of embracing an alternative, right, imperial project, right, an alternative project of empire in Japan, et cetera. So I wonder if you would talk about that sort of contradiction and the relationship of your own of your subjects to this tension. For Christopher, Tinson, you sort of talked about your subjects in and out of the left, and a shout out, or the sort of framework of in and out of the left more broadly, right? Shout out to Professor Dawson. And you also said, this was not just sort of intellectual questions, but these was, it was a search for a framework to sort of improve the material conditions of the lives of workers all over the world. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about this. This sort of, we're very familiar with this tension between the Black left or the so-called white left, or a Western left, or a European left, or whatever. Is this for your subjects? Does this become a creative tension, or is it, necessarily a source of disillusionment, right? Which I think is a story that we're more sort of familiar with. And finally, Ashley Farmer, talking about Queen Mother Moore. I have so many questions about Queen Mother Moore, so I'm trying to restrain myself. One of my questions I have about Queen Mother is relationship to Black feminism, because it strikes me that some of the most masculinist characters not just in the Black Power movement, but certainly in the Black Power movement, they were always very quick to praise Queen Mother, and to praise Queen Mother quite publicly, right? And it seemed to me Queen Mother was never she never objected to that recognition. But it seems to me that quite often the sort of honorifics, the veneration takes the form of a kind of maternalist praise, right? Like the mother of our movement. This, in other words, this kind of symbolic recognition that doesn't perhaps fundamentally challenge, at least not in their framings, their own sort of patriarchal position or their own sexism. So I wonder if you talk about that, Queen Mother's relationship to Black feminism more broadly. So we're doing okay for time. So maybe if we can just go through Blaine, Tinson, and Farmer. And certainly, again, you all feel free to talk to each other and respond to each other as well.
Thank you so much. And all excellent questions. One of the challenges, I think, when we're studying and certainly writing, thinking about Black internationalism, as several folks have already pointed out, is just the fact that the histories can be so messy. Quite frankly, that's just the best way to describe it. And I say that because when we're thinking about solidarities and networks and collaborations, the assumption is always that individuals are forging collaborations because they see eye to eye, and that is largely true, right? It's difficult to forge a collaboration with someone if you don't at least have, some connected tissue. There needs to be something that brings you together that you agree upon. At the same time, it doesn't mean that you agree on everything. It doesn't even mean that, that the collaboration somehow takes away from the fact that there are sometimes conflicting dynamics within the kinds of networks that you're forming. So what do I mean? I mean, this comes to the surface as we're thinking through specifically the narrative that I tell about, the ways that some Black women in the 20th century were trying to forge collaborations with Japan. Of course, we all understand the role that Japan played actually, as we're thinking through empire, the role that Japan played in blocking efforts for self-determination of other groups. And so what is frustrating, certainly for me as a historian and someone pulling together this narrative, is sort of reading through these narratives where Black women in the 1930s, for example, I think about this at the moment, when Japan invades Manchuria, and you see these activists trying to make sense of it. And there's, it's like, okay, they're able to say, listen, Japan is strong. Japan is an ally in the global struggle for freedom. We can imagine, Japanese people as standing with Black people to challenge white supremacy. And then this moment happens where they see the same brutality that they're critiquing ultimately taking place, right, with the historical actors that they see as allies in the struggle. And so while they're saying we're going to collaborate with Japan in our quest for self-determination, they're watching Japan block self-determination efforts from other groups. They're watching them brutalize and terrorize, Chinese people, and yet it appears that it's not enough for many of these activists to walk away from the collaboration, because there's still a desire to dismantle white supremacy, and there's still a belief that Japan is an ally. There's still a belief that somehow one can make use of the brutality. It's an odd sort of framing, but activists, in fact, go as far as to say that, to say, well, yes, Japan is brutal, but we can use it for our benefit, right? We can actually stand with them in order to ensure that Black people have liberation, that Black people are able to establish for themselves, their own nation states, for example. And clearly that's problematic. And part of why it's so difficult is looking back and having to tell this story through our lens, throughout the 21st century lens. It's very difficult. And so part of what I try to do when it comes to writing about Black internationalism, I don't always agree. And actually, most times I don't agree with the folks I write about, to be honest. But I try to understand why. I try to explain, certainly for myself, but certainly for readers, the context. And so what I find are people, for example, they think about 1919, they think about the Paris Peace Conference, they think about this symbolic gesture, they think about Japan, right, presenting this, this racial equality proposal. And for them, that's so meaningful, and they hold on to that, right? Or they hold on to 1904, 1905, when Japan is able to defeat Russia. So they hold on to these moments, symbolic moments, certainly, that, and for them, these, that's the evidence to be able to push forward with these kinds of solidarities and collaborations. And that means sometimes, quite frankly, looking the other way, or finding a way to excuse the other moments that like fly in the face, right, of everything else that they just held up as the model, as a standard. That happens often, I think, in narratives of Black internationalism. And I think as historians, part of what we need to do is pull all of these narratives to the surface, because it helps us understand, the messiness of politics. Quite frankly, I see so many parallels to this current moment when we think about the kinds of collaborations that people are forging today and how they're trying to liberate themselves. Sometimes, we say it all the time, but it's true that politics make for strange bedfellows, and that is true today as it was in the 1930s and 40s. So I certainly look forward to more of these conversations. But I think if you're not finding tensions and contradictions in your work, something's wrong. I resist simplistic, easy, happy-go-lucky narratives. I simply do, because I just think life is far more complicated than that.
Absolutely, yeah. So transnationalism is messy business, right? It's not at all a question of moral or political purity or consistency. And I shudder to think, right, we're all full of contradictions, as are our historical subjects. And I shudder to think what the historians will write about us 50, 100 years from now? What was Russ thinking? You know, couldn't he, well, you know, these contradictions. Anyway, Professor Tinson, the question about
delusion,
relationship to the white left.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to spend too much time on the white left for us. I mean, I think that I wanted to point that out just to show the origin of the term internationalism, because I think your term disillusionment was at the center of it. It's vis-a-vis Black workers, which is to say, you know, who's seen as a worker? What value does the worker have as a kind of political, you know, what political stature does the worker have, and who do we visualize as the epitome of the international worker? And the fact that for European workers in the 19th century, the formerly enslaved in the United States weren't immediately seen, right, as workers on the same level, worthy of having their labor valued or protected, right, even after the fact. And I think, you know, we have to stop there just to think about the term Black internationalism, just to understand that, you know, these terms don't mean the same thing in every era, right? There's not, you know, they're not static terms. They also change and respond to different things. I think that the heart of it is a question of power, right? And how do you figure out on which side of the power are you, and how can you leverage power to improve your life? And I think that, you know, worker solidarity is about bringing masses of people together who are similarly situated to push for better conditions for all of these people. I think black laborers and organized laborers were just profoundly disillusioned by the fact that, you know, we're claiming worker solidarity in their view, and somebody else is saying, well, we're claiming our own worker solidarity. And so when you get into the interests, the particular interests and the specific interests of groups, then that takes the focus of people's organizing. So I think trying to think about a global workers' solidarity is a monumental, messy thing, as you point out. But I think that it doesn't mean it shouldn't be attempted. It doesn't mean also that the consciousness of yourself as a global worker needs to be disbanded just because we can't bring about tangible victories in every single location, right? And so what matters in Europe, what matters in Africa, what matters in the United States may be different things, but the consciousness of oneself as a worker, as a part of this kind of larger class, I think is where the value lay, right? The value is there. And so I think that, you know, in thinking about people like the Revolutionary Action Movement, who some were workers and some were, you know, students and some were, you know, intellectuals and some were artists, right? Thinking about how do we frame a Black vision of the world that does not include United States imperialism, that does not include siphoning off people's resources, that does not include all forms of exploitation. And I think that those are big ideas already, right? Just on their face, like, let's get rid of exploitation. Okay, what does that mean, right? Let's get rid of, you know, discrimination at the polls. Okay, so who's down with that as a project? And is that an end in itself, or is that towards some kind of larger victory that we could imagine? It's the reason why people struggle over war efforts all the time, right? I mean, it's the idea of, you know, why are you going to war on behalf of, are you going to war on behalf of imperialism, or are you going to have on behalf of yourself, or are you going on behalf of what? And I think those are kind of entanglements that come up when we're thinking about global solidarity, right? But I think that folks are willing to work through the tensions, work through the problems, work through the contradictions. And that has to be a space of debate, questioning, constant study all the time. And then also a kind of political agility, if you will, to understand nuance and to ask questions that might not pertain to one's own self-interest immediately. I think that that's an interesting piece that I think a lot of people discover when we start to study Black internationalism. But the last thing I'll say is, you know, this issue of consciousness is important, and the consciousness of oneself as a part of a global laboring force, a consciousness of the politicization of labor, I think is important. And also, you know, how could you leverage, you know, the mechanisms of international law to really bring to bear some attention on your circumstance. And one example that I'm thinking about here is the We Charge Genocide campaign to actually utilize the term genocide, which was a new term of the United Nations that had been introduced to really talk about genocide against Jews. And William Patterson and the Civil Rights Congress are saying, well, let's use that to look at Black conditions in the United States. And that petition is a historic petition that I think is a kind of a gift that keeps on giving, because you could do the international work to really think about how we frame these things internationally. But then also he gives data that we can actually look at on the local level, different counties, large and small, in Georgia and Alabama and throughout the United States, where racial terror is the rule of the day. So how do you, what do you leverage? What's the lens? And then what are the kind of tools to bring attention to your condition? And then who are you in the global order of labor, I think is what all these folks were trying to struggle around. But I think that there was a willingness to struggle that I think is worthy of our study. And I think that willingness comes from that sense of consciousness of that you're not just here alone as a self-interested entity, you are a part of something larger, a part of the larger humanity and the human project.
Absolutely, love it. So Black internationalism, not as a static term or idea, right? An evolving, transforming ideal, and our responsibility to sort of track this evolution, this transformation. And I love that phrase, that pregnant phrase you used, political agility, right? Okay, and finally, I asked Professor Farmer a question about Queen Mother Moore and Black feminism.
Talk about messy. It's also just funny that as Chris is talking, Queen Mother Moore was the kind of intellectual leader and figurehead of RAM, right? She also knew William Patterson and actively worked, with Recharge Genocide. So it really is quite, sometimes it is breathtaking to see the expansiveness of her work. So on that subject, she remained in the movement long enough to see both Black power and Black feminism come of age. So the question then is, how did she navigate that? So she would never call herself a feminist, and more so than that, she leaned heavily into patriarchy and this idea of women as kind of the mothers and molders of the nation, and men as the head of the Black nation, real and imagined. So what did this look like? It looked like, every single organization, with the exception of that one, the Ethiopian women I talked about, she was by all means the most famous person in the new organization. I'm talking about 60s on, right? The mentor, often maybe even the executive secretary or figurehead or face, but she was never the leader, right, of the movement. Even the reparations campaigns and groups for which she really was a part of, she never took that leadership role, always giving it to a Black man instead. Moreover, she trafficked in, the Moynihan-esque rhetoric of, Black men need to lead the family. She was down with cultural nationalist ideas of polygamy. She often, there's a story of her at her last kind of major conference on reparations, in which she gathered all the women who were in COBRA, the reparations group, together to tell them that they needed to take care of the men and marry multiple ones of them take on wives, right? So every part of this, is invested in a very, early 20th century male-led Black nationalist idea. Now, we need to then interrogate why that is. Is this what she actually believed, or is this a strategy to remain relevant? Russ, what you hit on about kind of being a maternal world, or maternal kind of relationship, I think is spot on. When by the time the 60s and 70s come around and Black power comes around, not only is she kind of aged out of that, right, young person's movement, as it were, but she's also a woman. So how do you keep being at the head and at the center, and at all these moments where we're making, key moves, from signing the Declaration for the Republic of New Africa to, the Sixth Pan-African Congress? You position yourself, right, as the mother and the mentor of the movement. You are a venerated figure, right? And that catches on like wildfire. I've asked probably 15 people. No one can tell me the story of where she became Queen Mother, right? She just was at some point. I'm not unconvinced that she just decided this was the way to go and then created an origin story out of that, right? So we might see her positionality as a shrewd understanding of the political landscape and an attempt to make sure that she did not get sidelined in conversations, as we saw Black power in some ways going increasingly masculinist, right? The other thing we have to think about too is that despite this rhetoric, and gender politics that she's putting forward, she's running things, and she's running things at multiple organizations at grassroots levels. She was articulating back in, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, what some would call now, an intersectional Black feminist stance. She was giving lectures, asking Black women, why did they think about the fact that they were poor and Black, right? And women, and how is that affecting them? You might also say that's somewhat resurrecting, Claudia Jones's triple oppression or Louise Thompson Patterson's triple oppression. But I point this all out to say is that it's very clear that she understood and operationalized what we would now call a Black feminist analysis, even as she put up a front of being, invested in the patriarchy of nation building and Black nationalism. So I think as students and historians of her, we need to try to parse out, and something I'm still going back and forth with, as to how much we want to see it as a strategy, and how much we want to believe that this was really her set of politics that she was buying into. So, again, it's just messy and complicated.
Part of what makes her such a fascinating and important figure. Professor Eula Taylor, if Professor Taylor is watching, might say that Queen Mother was invested in or navigated within the promise of patriarchy, right? All right, okay, so we do have some, what's that?
Or a community feminist, right?
Right, yes, absolutely. So we do have some questions coming in, and from the audience, I want to get to them. I wanted to, there are some overarching questions I had. Many of them have been more or less answered. Maybe we'll do one more sort of round, if you will, and I'll just throw out a bunch of questions. I'll do what I've learned not to do in the classroom, which is to ask multi-part complex questions. I always stump my students with that. So I'll just throw out some questions, and you can, any one of you in any order can answer any of these questions or none at all, or sort of engage what other panelists have already said, and then we'll try and shift to the Q&A. So I guess sort of one question that's already been sort of implicit in our remarks is the sort of question of the language that we use, that we as sort of historical interpreters use, and the language that our historical subjects themselves use, right? The analytic or political frameworks that we find useful and they find useful, and how we grapple with that in our writing. So, we already raised the question of internationalism or transnationalism, but there's so many, other formulations: diaspora, Pan-Africanism, anti-colonialism, some of which we've already, invoked: post-colonialism, third worldism, Afro-Asianism, Bandung down the line, proletarian internationalism, Black Atlantic, Black Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder if anybody wanted to speak to terminology. So that's one question. What are the frameworks that you find most useful and why? There's another question, a larger question perhaps, about our basic purpose as historians, our sort of basic historiographical purpose as we write these transnational histories. Do we think of ourselves as sort of reframing, the kind of more established histories, narratives of the 20th century Black freedom struggle? Are we rewriting it altogether? Do we, perhaps we don't always write with these sort of grand, purposes in the back of our consciousness, but do we think that we're fundamentally rewriting, reframing? What is our larger purpose? And then I guess we've already talked a little bit about the relationship of our subjects to the idea of the nation state, the ideal of the nation state. And I just wonder if there's anything more that we'd like to say about, how our subjects are sort of forging alternative national identities. Are they, in many cases, fundamentally rejecting the nation state as a basis for identity and liberation, or are they seeking to expand, rethink, et cetera? And I recall, historian Brenda Plummer talking about, African-American internationalists in the era of decolonization, and saying that, many of them, and perhaps practically all of them, essentially accepted this model of the nation state as the framework of political possibilities. So I'm wondering to what extent that's true of your historical characters. So we do have some audience Q&A coming in, but if any of us want to take a stab at any of these provocations, then we certainly have a few minutes to do so.
I'll just quickly jump in and say a few words about terminology. What I found over the years is that it really matters who you're speaking to. And I encountered this presenting my work, for example, when I tend to talk in spaces where there are primarily historians of maybe American foreign relations. And I say internationalism, they're generally thinking about nation states, and they're thinking about the connections between nation states. And of course, I have no interest in talking about nation states in that way. I'm primarily talking about the circulation of ideas. I'm certainly talking about the movement of individuals, which for many of the folks in that particular camp, perhaps transnationalism is a more appropriate term. Like you, Professor Rickford, I tend to use the two interchangeably. But also, whenever I use the term, I'm clear. I try to always define it. So because I recognize that people interpret it in different ways, and even among women historians, there's been a trend, certainly in much of the literature, where certain individuals will use internationalism to talk about developments before 1945, and then there'd be a shift in the language post 1945. For me, I really like Black internationalism as a term, and part of why I like it is because I see Black internationalism as an umbrella. I see it as an overarching term that actually encapsulates many varied expressions. And so when someone says to me, well, what about Pan-Africanism? I'll say Pan-Africanism is one expression of Black internationalism. There are distinctions when we talk about Pan-Africanism, and primarily we are talking about people of African descent, right, and the kinds of solidarities and movements that they form. We're certainly, and then of course we have to get into, well, what do you mean Pan-Africanism? You mean, Pan-Africanism with sort of grassroots Pan-Africanism? Are you talking about more formal expressions, right, of Pan-Africanism? The kinds of questions that George Padmore would be asking. But still, when I teach Black internationalism, I always make it clear that there are varied expressions, and Pan-Africanism is not the same as Afro-Asian solidarity, but they're both two different strands and two important expressions that speak to the way that people think beyond the confines of the nation state, the way that people maintain a global racial consciousness, the way that people situate themselves as members of a global polity, right, that clearly breaks free from the limits of the specific nation state. And so I really do appreciate the term Black internationalism for its flexibility and what some people see as some sort of frustration. I know there are people who get very frustrated with the term and they say, oh, Black internationalism is everything, then if it's everything, it's nothing. No, I don't think it's everything, but I do think that there are varied expressions. And sometimes, there are similarities and sometimes there are differences, and that's okay. That certainly doesn't make me uneasy as someone who writes about Black internationalism. I'm very clear about what I mean. I'm generally thinking about global racial consciousness. I'm generally thinking about the kinds of solidarities and networks that people are forming. I'm certainly thinking about circulation of ideas, as much as I am thinking about people. I'm less interested in relations between nation states, but others are concerned about that. And certainly that's part of the narrative too. And so I just think it's important to recognize that these are terms that, as Professor Tinson mentioned, have shifted over time. You know, that they, as we're moving from period to period, internationalism means different things. For some people, it's a pre-1945 versus a post-1945. That's not my line of demarcation. You know, I don't see it that way, but others do, and that's all right. As long as you are, I would just say, especially for those who, you know, I know there's some grad students, you know, tuning in. Whatever term you're going to use, and I say this to my students, I'm not going to quibble with you. Whatever term you want to use it, but just be very clear that you define it. Don't use it and assume that anyone's going to understand what you mean. You say feminism, tell me what you mean, because I can tell you 4 different ways to define feminism, and there are connections among those definitions, and there are also some distinctions among those definitions. So you tell me what you mean, and if you tell me what you mean, then we'll be all right, right? You determine the parameters, and you show through the evidence. I think once you do that, you avoid the kinds of confusion and drama, and it truly is drama, that I think people go through, and they say, well, is this Black internationalism? Is this transnationalism? Well, isn't that Pan-Africanism? Well, actually, be very clear. You know, what are you talking about? Are you talking about Pan-Africanism? And if you're not talking about Pan-Africanism, you're talking about something else, say what it is you're talking about and explain it. So I hope that helps for those who are grappling. And I would say I grapple too with these terms. And you know, as a grad student, I would stress out about this constantly. But my mentors told me then, as I tell people now, just select, be clear about what you are going to use and define it, and you'll be all right.
I'll just add, oh, go ahead, Ashley.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna take us in a different direction though, and just talk briefly about this kind of idea of nation states in a different way. And one that I think really stands out for Queen Mother Moore. One of the things that people may not know about her is that she was part of a kind of late 1950s, early 60s campaign to rid us of the term Negro, right? Her sisters were involved, and she thought that Negro was a term. But behind this idea was that she felt, and the group that she was working with felt, that the term Negro had been so weighed down with everything that was, you know, negative about Black people, and you know, kind of the work of white supremacy, to the point that it became something that paralyzed Black people and made them not seize their work. But one of the things that I think, as I've gone on and studied this kind of idea of what she called de-Negroizing people in depth and treated it as a theory in its own right, is that I think what she was saying is that if we can move away from this term and adopt a new one, you adopt a political identity that was unbridled by white supremacist norms. And that basis of like a positive self-conception could be the grounds for developing an alternative identity that was not connected to the American nation state, and also one that could connect you to other Black people around the world. So while it may have seemed kind of as just a quibble over terminology, as we know what Black people like to identify as changes over time, she was really arguing and organizing that, you know, through adopting a new identity and a new set of terminology, we could decolonize our minds, and therefore also decolonize our idea or relationship to the American nation state. So I do think that there were many interesting ways through which she tried to promote an understanding outside of nation boundaries. And I think a linguistic territory is one that's not often thought about, but one that I think she made a considerable contribution in.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, those two comments. And I think the only thing I can add is just, you know, the folks that we're studying are trying to break out of or away from the U.S. imperial project, right? I think that there's an explicit attempt to dislodge it as a project, but also make sure that Black people aren't complicit in that in different ways. And I think identifying that is a kind of major organizing or galvanizing idea for a lot of the activists that we study. But it's also to say that the domestic conditions of oppression that Black people face here in the United States is a domestic feature of that global imperial project, right? And so they link those two things, right? That what we're dealing with here in the United States, whether it be lynching, whether it be the carceral state, is a part of the imperial project. It's just the domestic location of the imperial project. And people making that connection are the folks that I think many of us are studying, right? At least that's when I talk about people who are revolutionary nationalists, that's the framework that they're and the connection that they're making. and that revolutionary nationalism is essentially an international project. Even though they use the term nationalism, it's really just to show the domestic face of this imperial project. And I think that I just want to add that to this whole thing. And I also want to lift up one of our brothers, Kido Swan, his latest work. He uses the term radical diaspora, right, to really talk about the way in which these kind of global networks take shape, but that you're talking about a specific kind of lean, right, where they're not trying to just wave a flag for a nation or make apologies for imperial policy. They're really trying to work towards eradication of oppression. And I think that lends itself to particular kind of alignments and allegiances.
Right. Certainly the point of Getachew makes in World Making After Empire as well, right? You know, as we were talking about, as Farmer was talking about, this sort of the crusade, right, against Negro, right? Crusade against Negro, one of the most fascinating aspects of Queen Mother's and consistent aspects of Queen Mother's work. I was thinking about, you know, the black arts poet Nikki Giovanni, who says, I think in the early 70s, she says, you know, Afro-Americans are the newest people on earth. And I think in part, the reason she says that is that she understood that the shift to Blackness, or the shift to, you know, Africanness or Afro-American or whatever the term, was not just a sort of shift in terminology or semantics. It was an ontological shift, right? There was a new subjectivity that was pregnant with political possibility. Okay, so we've got time for maybe a couple of questions here. I think I'm gonna read them individually. So the first question is coming to us fittingly for a panel on transnationalism from South Africa. So Vusumuzi Kumalo has a question, I think primarily for Professor Farmer, but to all of the panelists. She says, I'm asking this question from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Unlike white supremacists who viewed Blacks as a problem to be countered, Blacks in Africa and the Americas often viewed themselves as potential saviors who could redeem a modern civilization corrupted by exclusivist racism. How does your work engage this question, considering that white supremacists argued that the history of Blackness began with the contact with white civilization? So how did transnational or transatlantic Black connections challenge this idea? I guess this idea that the very inception of Blackness, that the origin of Blackness, the source of Blackness. Perhaps this is also a question about history, in the sense that so much of white supremacy is about the erasure of a Black past, independent of a sort of white global project of empire and imperialism. So that's a very broad question, but any of the panelists who want to take a stab at that?
I'll just jump in briefly, speaking again through kind of a lens of Queen Mother more. One of the things that she took away from Garveyism and, you know, became a student of was Black history, right? And she saw this as, you know, not thinking of yourself as, you know, this brute from Africa, but really going back and understanding the rich and diverse history of African civilization from, you know, pre-slave trade to the present. And one of the ways in which we see, for example, her try to counteract this is in a speech in the All-African Women's Conference in 1972. She sits and talks to women from across the continent, and she says that she kind of creates I guess you would call it kind of an essentialist but matrilineal understanding of the birth of African civilization on through the creation of the Americas, right? And her goal here is to say, basically, we all are united in our origins and our history. We're all united in this front against white supremacy, and therefore we should all be working together today towards that goal. Now, did it traffic in tropes that we might find cringy or problematic now? Certainly, right? But I do think that that is just a very small example of one of the attempts for them to try to marry this idea of recovering the history of Africa and using it and kind of politically in the service of uniting people across the diaspora. And she was certainly invested in that, even as she kind of thought of Africa as an undifferentiated continent, and kind of origin stories in a very similar way. As far as your question about kind of the saviors, I think Queen Mother Moore never got to spend extensive time in different African countries. She kind of went on a grand tour, but there are many other expats, right, particularly from the Black Power movement, that did get to spend significant amounts of time in, say, Ghana, Tanzania, et cetera. And at least in my experience from the women that I've studied, you know, they were somewhat in for a rude awakening. You know, everybody has ideas about what life is going to be until you go and sit down and work there. And I don't know necessarily that they thought they would be saviors, but I think they thought that they were going to be instrumental in a nation building process in the post-colonial era that they found that was not as simple as straightforward, or that needed them as much as they thought they did. So it certainly was something that as we saw air travel and desegregation and Black people get a little bit of money and be able to actually go and visit African countries, you saw them have to kind of reckon with their ideas about what Black Americans could do, what problems different African peoples were facing with a very different lens.
I'm tempted to ask a follow-up question about, you know, again, this question of disillusionment and transnationalism, because so often when we're talking about transnational activities, what's involved, what's central is this ideal, this imaginary, this oftentimes an idealization of, quite often it's a place, a site, a relationship, and, you know, the reality so often falls short of that ideal. And so I do have a sort of question in the back of my mind about this sort of, so much of my work ends up being about this kind of arc of disillusionment. And I worry about that because I think, like many of us are in this business in part because we do think that there's a fundamental didactic value to these narratives, that we're not just sort of rummaging around in the archives, but we have something to say politically to the present. So I wonder about that, you know, sort of transcending that arc of disillusionment. I don't know if we'll have time to get to that, but I do want to ask this second question that we have in the chat, and this is from Dr. Kristen Anderson Bricker, who asks, what language do these conversations occur in across national boundaries, right? Did the languages used change over the course of the 20th century? Did activists critique English as part of the white supremacist system? So it's a very, very useful question, because so often, of course, when we're talking about transnational exchange, there is the question of translation, right? As Brother Brent would remind us, right? This question of translation, this question of understanding, of comprehension. So I don't know if folks would like to sort of speak to that.
Keisha, go ahead. I'll follow you.
Well, what I would say is that, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I'm certainly so excited about when I think about, we haven't said much about the development of the field of Black internationalism broadly, but certainly Professor Rickford alluded to earlier, the field itself is just growing. And one of the most exciting aspects, I think, of, you know, a lot of the new scholarship is helping us see the diverse connections and solidarities that people were able to form, and primarily getting us to think about the various languages that people were utilizing to make those connections possible. You know, in my work, I'm primarily focused on activists who are communicating in English. And yes, certainly some activists, I think, had critiques about English in general. But you know, for me, you know, I'm able to tell an aspect of the story through individuals, certainly in the United States, connecting to English-speaking countries, or in the Caribbean, And also able to connect to a broader movement in Latin America, primarily because so much of the Black press provided coverage in various languages. And here I'm thinking about just even the Negro World. The Negro World having an English section clearly printed, published in English, but also having articles in Spanish, for example. So that was a way for people to, in Spanish-speaking countries who had an opportunity to read the Negro World, to be fully informed, about several developments taking place in other parts of the globe. So there are certainly venues that made it possible to bring people together, so that language differences in language didn't become a barrier, but actually became a tool to collaborate. And so I'm thinking about Celeste Moore's work. She wrote a really great chapter, and in a volume that Ashley and I edited with Chris Cameron, New Perspectives in the Black Intellectual Tradition. And I love that chapter because one of the things she does in that chapter is talk about the practice of Black internationalism through the study of French. And then she's looking at, at professors, for example, at HBCUs. She's looking at all of these writers in the US, but finding all of these connections, right, through the study of French, through the language itself, to tap into a broader French-speaking Black world, right? And so that's just one example, and her larger study coming out in the fall will really help to tease out a lot of this narrative as well. So all this is to say that I think there's certainly more work to be done. And I'm thinking about, I'm blanking on the name of the scholar, but there are several scholars I know now who are working even on Black internationalism and centering Haiti, and specifically thinking through, how activists were able to forge solidarities, were able to connect with one another, and they're able to effectively utilize archives in Haiti, and think about a connection from Haiti, to Harlem, or even to London. So there's a lot of work being done, I think, that helps us see language as a tool and not a barrier. So I hope that helps in answering the question.
Yeah, I could just add that I'm glad you mentioned the Garvey paper, because I think that that's one of the clear examples of really trying to break through a particular kind of linguistic understanding of Black solidarity. Another example comes to mind is the fact that, C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian scholar, Marxist scholar, worked through learning French in order to write a book about the Haitian Revolution, the Black Jacobins. I think that that's a solitary act, but had a monumental impact on how we understood, at least the Black left, understood historical formation in the 20th century. I would say that. And I want to go back to the question of, and then the other example I was thinking about was Ngugi wa Thiong'o had wrote this famous essay in the 70s about the abolition of the English department, right? Like, why at these modern African universities are we, studying English literature, Latin, right? Like, not to say that you shouldn't study those things, right? Don't want to go down the Du Bois, Booker T rabbit hole here. But the other part is to think about, how do we privilege African language, indigenous African languages in these universities? That was the point of Ngugi's article. And I don't want to get into the politicization around indigeneity either, all right, for all the scholars here. But I want to go back to this question of Black people being a savior. I mean, I don't think that there's a savior complex necessarily. Maybe for some folks that were Garvey, yes, probably is a clear example of kind of like just that, complex of saying, hey, I have the answers. I think that comes through in different kinds of spaces for folks at different times. But there is something to be said about Black people's articulation about oppression. If you allow Du Bois, for example, Claudia Jones, Paul Robeson, to play an active role in the formation of the United Nations Charter, that thing that document, that entity, that body is a different body, right? For example, right? If you center Black struggle in these global processes of state making and legislation, Black people tend, and not just Black people from the United States, but Black people around the world tend to have more to say about the well-being of the world and distribution of resources than do political elites who actually write the documents, who actually sit in the offices, right? And so if you let these folks help write the law, you might, and I'm willing to put some money on this, you would have more equality in the law, right? If you let Angela Davis and the women of the feminist movement write the actual state documents about reproductive rights, about our mobility, about education, to go to Russell's work, right? That the imagining that's there is way beyond what the political elites end up with. So I don't want to say that there's a messianic complex where all Black activists feel like they're going somewhere to save somebody. But if you think about what they're saying and you institutionalize what they're saying, it tends to bring about more equality. I would say that. So it's a different way of answering the question, but I also think that they'd be willing to be challenged and struggle through, many of the tensions that will emerge. And I would even say that if you, in our day, if you, and this might be controversial for some of our listeners and viewers, but if you let people in the so-called squad that's in Congress, right? If they write more of our legislation, I guarantee we're going to have much more of a broader sense of political possibility than we currently do, right? And so I just want to make sure that we understood that as well.
So I had just finished writing an absolutely brilliant sum up question that was going to pull everything together and just wrap us up perfectly in the next 3 minutes, which is the time that we have remaining. However, I see in the chat that there actually is one more question. So let me just ask that quickly, but basically this is the last 45 seconds for each of you, so you can close in any way you choose. But Laura Adderley asks, were the multilingual engagements more common? Okay, we'll have to forgive because this did stem from the last discussion. Were the multilingual engagements more common among elite literary actors who were coming from a sphere in which that kind of translingual work had its own valence? I'm thinking of, is it Langston Hughes, who translated some of Jacques Romain and those early 20th century Africana diaspora Black literary circles. Also, to Professor Blain's comment, now we got 2 minutes left, to Professor Blain's comment about inter-Caribbean, what do we think about Black internationalism within particular parts of diaspora, particularly within the global South, Pan-Caribbean things that may not reach into Western Europe or North America, engagement across African continent that may not engage outside of the continent? Well, clearly we need a follow-up to this panel in order to engage those questions, but I did want to ask them, and if there are closing thoughts that we have, maybe just 30 or 45 seconds each, we can offer them now.
I'll just, earlier I had mentioned just various scholars doing amazing work, and so I just want to use the opportunity to give a shout out to one scholar whose name is Felix Jean-Louis, and he just finished a dissertation called Between Harlem and Paris, Haitian Internationalism in the Interwar Period. And his work is remarkable, and in fact gets to the question about language and translation. I mean, part of what he is doing is tracing all of these intellectuals who do speak multiple languages and are able to therefore engage a wide array of texts, and primarily so individuals even on U.S. soil, right, being able to grapple, I think, and deeply with the literature that's coming out of Haiti in this period, and being able to forge solidarity with Haitian intellectuals, because language is not a barrier in this case. So that's just one person that I would recommend as a young scholar who's doing amazing work that's going to add a lot of complexity to this conversation. I just don't think we have time to get into all the other stuff, but I will simply say that part of what to me is so exciting about studying Black internationalism is just how rich it is. And, the more you study, the more you write about it, the more you learn, and you realize that there are all of these gaps that we have yet to fill. So I certainly hope that everyone listening will be encouraged to keep writing and keep studying to answer all of these questions too that we're asking.
Thanks so much, Keisha. I guess we have permission here to go a minute or two over. I'm wondering if Ashley and Christopher, in closing, you might just sort of, if there's an aspect of your work that you think resonates here that you didn't get a chance to offer, you can certainly touch on it now. But I also was coming back to this question that's been sort of haunting me about the sort of political value to the kind of work we do for our contemporary moment, and for the future. I mean, so often, because we try to be careful historians and we're attentive to these complexities, we end up highlighting, and even this conversation, we end up highlighting contradictions, inconsistencies, missteps, et cetera, et cetera. But is there, despite that or because of that, are there sort of clear political lessons to our work? And or should we be thinking in that way? Should we be writing in that way? Should we be speaking quite explicitly and consciously to the problems of our contemporary time? I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that in our last few seconds here.
I'll just add briefly that for the folks that I study in the later half of the 20th century, to get past the language barrier, sometimes they decided to try to learn one particular one, real or invented, as a way to kind of get around this issue that linguistic barriers that we're facing. To your question about the political imperatives, I will just maybe speak to what I've learned thus far in studying Queen Mother more. I mean, to see her commitment to staying the course to a central set of principles and for very real things to change in her lifetime, I think is one of the lessons that it's never easy, but if one believes that this is how the world should look and kind of sets one's compass there, then we can be guided in different ways and in different choices that at least hopefully lead us there eventually, if not in our lifetimes. And then secondly, I would just say that that the idea that we're constantly looking at a bigger Black community really undermines the investment in American individualism, which the American nation state is trying to use both to separate us as a Black community within the US and writ large. So she continually reminds me to always be thinking global in my vision today, right? And how I can find those linkages so that that it can be my kind of daily part intellectually of not investing in the American nation state in the ways that are incredibly problematic.
Right on. Brother Tinson, you've got the last word.
Yeah, no, I think, struggling, writing, however we organize against white supremacy is actually preservation of our environment. So I think thinking about, Black environmentalism, thinking about Black futurity, the work that we're doing now is trying to promote those things, right? Trying to promote our survival, trying to understand what kind of world we're trying to create. And I think that white supremacy, the resurgence of white nativism, xenophobia, these kinds of issues that we're struggling around, our work should speak to that. If not directly, it should be leaning in that direction, because we are talking about a global sense of justice and not just, trying to do solidarity for solidarity's sake, but it's really try to bring about a new world. And I know that that's utopian, and I know that that's universalist, but I do think that the people who are really committed deeply, Queen Mother Moores, Tony K. Bambaras, the folks that we're naming, did have that vision. You can't read Jude Jordan and not think that she was not serious about trying to create another world. And I think that inspires me. It also challenges me. It also terrifies me, because it always reminds that I'm probably not doing enough. But the least that I could do is make my words sing across the page to speak to that possibility of a new world. And I hope in that sense, I'm keeping the tradition alive.
Beautiful. Another world is possible. Thank you so much to Keisha Blain, to Christopher Tinson, and to Ashley Farmer. You all are my peers, but you're also my role models. Thanks so much to the AHA and to Debbie Doyle and to Victor Del Toro for their support. And thanks to all of you out there, and let's build another world.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'd just like to thank again our sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions and joined us today, and a special thanks to our panelists. Have a great day.